And we have quite a few world-renowned affiliated faculty members that are going to be sharing their expertise with you today. And so this project that everyone's here today to participate in, to attend, is our affiliated faculty seminar series titled Supporting Students with IDD Through the Education Experience. Each presentation will cover the impact of the IDD population as it relates to their educational experience. And world-renowned Texas A&M faculty members will be sharing their research knowledge and experiences related to the topic of the month. And as you can see here, understanding and supporting the IEP and evaluation process is our theme, is our title for the month here. This series is an interactive 1.5-hour seminar designed to increase knowledge and awareness for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities among faculty, staff, students, and our community members at Texas A&M University and beyond. And this seminar is meant to promote strong dialogue about issues and information surrounding the support of students with IDD through the education experience. In doing so, the CDD affiliated faculty seminar series will work to promote a positive, equitable, accepting attitudes towards people with disabilities on campus, in schools, and in the community. Again, my name is Dr. Megan Orsag, and I will be helping to facilitate the in-person seminar here at Texas A&M campus. And Dr. Eric Roberts is going to be facilitating our Zoom virtual attendees. And so if you have a question, you are welcome to send a private message either to Eric or you can put it in the chat function and he will be helping to get your questions answered by Aaron. A plug for the rest of this spring semester. The first Tuesday of every month is when we will be holding our professional seminar series. And if you go to our website, which Eric will probably be sharing in our chat function shortly, you will see that our next session in March will be about the transition process and post-secondary education options. In April, we'll be talking about academics. In May, we'll be talking about communication and behavior. And in June, we'll be talking about peer-mediated intervention. So we hope that you guys join us for those. This is a reminder that this session will be recorded. Thank you, Dr. Whiteside. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erin Whiteside as our presenter and one of our affiliated faculty members, and she's going to be introducing herself and talking a little bit more about our topic. So thank you, Dr. Whiteside.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So as Dr. Orsag said, today I'm going to be talking about understanding and supporting the evaluation and IEP process. I tend to talk very quickly when I get excited, and I like this topic. So please feel free to throw in the chat that you need me to repeat something or slow down, and Dr. Roberts will help remind me to do that. A little bit about myself. So you know my background and why I'm talking about this. I started as an ABA clinician in an autism clinic or a clinic for serving students with autism. And I also started out as a paraprofessional, which is a term we'll be talking about here in a little bit. I provided services in students' homes, and then I also worked in a university clinic where I provided supports in areas such as feeding, toileting, communication, enhancing communication, and working towards more appropriate behaviors. And then I also worked for 3 years as a special education teacher in a life skills classroom, another term we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst, which really just means that I really love all things behavior, and I love figuring out why certain behaviors happen or aren't happening. Another important thing to know about me is that I come from a family of educators. You can see here at my graduation, my stepmother is a principal, my sister is a general education elementary school teacher, my mom is a school counselor, and my aunt is a reading specialist and teacher. And not pictured there are several more teachers. So I know a little bit about it all from the stories that I've heard in addition to the experiences that I've had. So today what we're going to talk about for many might be a review. For many of you, it might be brand new. And this is really just going to lay the foundation for knowledge around special education and a lot of the terms that you hear. A lot of times it's what we hear called as alphabet soup, and you just hear a bunch of letters thrown at you and you don't know what they mean. And so today is going to really lay that foundation for what all those letters mean, what the term means, and the general process that will go through for students to become evaluated and have an IEP and how that's developed. A key disclaimer is that different terms are available in different schools, in different districts, in different states. So I'm going to kind of talk about the foundational. I'm going to pull from what's kind of outlined in the federal law and some of what's outlined in Texas state law. But do know that I might say something and you might go to your school or your child's school tomorrow and they might use a different term, and that's okay. But I'll also help you find how you can learn about these different terms and what the new terms that you're hearing. But just know this is a start to kind of wade through all those letters. And hopefully it's helpful. And then finally, before we dive in, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. It was really challenging for me to figure out what we were going to talk about in an hour and a half without overwhelming you. And so again, this might be a review. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, but it'll definitely get you started. So we're going to start by talking about the key players. Before we dive into the what and the how and the when, I want to talk about who you might be working with. And two of the biggest players are TEA and IDEA. These are two terms that you might hear frequently throughout excuse me, this presentation and future presentations through this series. TEA stands for the Texas Education Agency. So that's the state agency, the state governing board that oversees public school education at the primary and secondary levels. So some of the terms that you'll hear me say, or some of the timelines and things like that, are decided by TEA. What they decide stems from IDEA, which is a law we'll talk about later, but I wanted to introduce it now. It stands for Individuals with Disabilities Act. There have been different reauthorization versions of this law, but it's commonly referred to as IDEA. And it is one of the laws that establishes access to education for students with disabilities. Another key player that we're going to talk about a lot are special educators. When you start this IEP process, you're going through the evaluation, you're receiving services. This is one person that you see a lot of. And there's been a lot of talk about education and special educators and what we do. Usually when you hear about a special educator, or actually this happened to me this weekend. Someone asked me what I taught and I said special education. And no lie, out of their mouth, they said, "You must be so patient. You have such a big heart." And I said, "You are sometimes right, not always, but what's more important is we do all these other things." So as I set the stage for all the things that happen in special education, I want to share my colleague, Dr. Melissa Fogarty's video that she did 3 years ago now, on what exactly a special educator does and all the things that come along with special education. And so after this video, we'll dive a little more into the sorry, have some echoes in here. We'll dive into all the different players that will help what she's talking about.
I used to be a special education teacher, and now I have the privilege of preparing the next generation of special education teachers at Texas A&M. However, yeah, right, a couple of you are here tonight, thank you. When people used to ask me what I did for a living and I said I was a special education teacher, without a doubt, I would get one of the following responses. "Oh, you must have a huge heart. Patience, you must have so much patience. Or it takes a special person to do that job. Am I right, special educators?" Yes. So tonight, those are all well-intended and nice things to say, but tonight we're going to talk a little bit about why special education teachers are more than a big old heart and a heap of patience. For those of you who do not know, special education teachers serve children with disabilities from early childhood to high school. They serve disabilities such as intellectual disabilities, autism, learning disabilities, emotional behavior disorders, and more. The disabilities range from mild to severe, from visible to invisible, academic, behavioral, social, and everything in between. Special education teachers teach in self-contained classrooms as well as inclusive environments. So I have 5 minutes to tell you everything that a special education teacher does in a day. Impossible, but I'm going to give you a quick rundown. First, special education teachers are researchers. They spend hours and hours collecting and analyzing data with assessment and observations, trying to crack the code of a challenging behavior or pinpoint the exact academic need of a student. Special education teachers are problem solvers, and they look to science for evidence-based practices, strategies, and tools to help their students reach their goals. Speaking of goals, did you know that there is a federal law that requires special education teachers to write individualized goals for each student? Special education teachers are specialists. They develop and design intensive interventions in a systematic, explicit manner to help students reach their goals. Special education teachers are consultants. If a student in the building is exhibiting a challenging behavior down the hall or struggling with an academic, it's usually the special education teacher that's called in for support. And finally, special education teachers are architects. They build long-term visions with their students and then build the foundations necessary to help their students transition to life after high school. So it takes extensive coursework in topics such as behavior principles, assessments, data collections, and so much more. It takes hours and hours of field experiences to practice those skills. It takes up to 4 certification exams. And it takes a fierce dedication to providing the best educational opportunities to all students, no matter how they enter the school building. So it is a difficult and demanding job, but one that is super important because it can change the outcome of a student's life. It could change a family's life. If a family has a child who is struggling with a communication or a behavior challenge, it can help change that family. It can help a child reach an academic goal when maybe that child was unreachable to others. It can help a child transition out of high school with job and college opportunities. So, unfortunately, right now in the United States and Texas, there is a staggering shortage of special education teachers. It is estimated that we need 9,000 special education teachers to keep up with the current demand in the state of Texas. Imagine a world without a special education teacher welcoming a child, no matter what, into our schools. We really need to recruit the best and the brightest special education teachers. And it starts by elevating the profession, and it starts by honoring those that are called to teach. And here's how we're gonna do that. We are gonna understand that special education teachers are highly trained and licensed professionals, similar to accountants, business professionals, medical professionals. 2, we're gonna encourage our promising students to enter the field of special education. I do it every day in 210, come on in. Number 3, consider sponsoring scholarships to offset the student loan debt of our graduating teachers. So finally, yes, special education teachers usually have the hearts the size of Texas. And yes, most are very patient. And yes, they are special, but that is not enough for our students. They are that and so much more. So the next time somebody tells you they're a special education teacher, now that you know more, what will you say? Thank you.
So I always like to show that video to get us started, so you have a little bit of the background on what special education is. And so if you have a student that might be going through this process, that is who you are working towards getting support from. There we go. So if you got the email prior to this talk, you'll see that there were some handouts. And so I just wanted to remind everyone that that does exist in all of the terms that I talk about throughout the entire presentation today. It has those listed out. So if you feel like you're frantically taking notes, know that you don't have to, although I welcome you to. and then you can just add notes on there if you like. So a couple of our key players, in addition to TEA, the Texas Education Agency, and IDEA, the federal law that governs all of the stuff we're talking about today, we have several key players that you might hear the names or acronyms thrown around during some planning, some meetings, things like that. The first is special educator, what we just learned about. You might hear this called the SPED teacher. This is someone who holds a certification. In Texas, they're expected to be certified in special education, general education, and ESL. That's 3 certifications. That's a lot. So the special ed teacher specializes in individualization strategies and strategies to accommodate some of your students' needs or to modify some of the content to help reach your students. So that's just a few things that the special educator does. The general educator, you might hear this called Gen Ed. They also hold a teaching certificate. They're going to specialize in the curriculum core content. So that grade level content, that is their specialty, and they are key players. A Gen Ed teacher is required to be in all ARD or IEP meetings. And again, also remember in Texas, special educators also have to have that certification. So they do have that specialization there too. You might hear paraprofessional or para. This might also be called a teaching assistant, but this is someone who is non-certified in the way that these other 2 teachers are certified. This is someone who supports the teacher, whoever's room they're assigned to, in providing instruction and behavior management and data collection and all the things that are necessary to provide those supports and accommodations to students. That paraprofessional can have anywhere from a high school degree to a higher ed degree. As I shared, I started as a paraprofessional myself after I graduated from undergrad. And that person can be paired with a classroom, with a grade level, or in less common, but still some cases with a specific student themselves. Some more terms, we have an educational psychologist. This might also be called an LSSP, which stands for Licensed Specialist in School Psychology. So this is someone who's gone to school and gets a special certification, usually master's or higher, in administering assessments, scoring assessments, all the standardized assessments. They write very long reports that are very intricate. If you're a teacher out there, please hug your school psychologist. They probably need one. And they're key members of these teams, particularly at the evaluation stage. They're the ones that are providing most of the assessments during those evaluations. We have an ARD facilitator. ARD is a keyword we're going to look at a little bit later, but an ARD facilitator is unique. It does not exist in all states, but in Texas we have it. And that's someone who must currently be or have been in the past a certified teacher with a bachelor's degree. So they need to have had that experience. And they are not a decision-making member of the teams that we'll talk about in a moment, but they help coordinate, plan, and facilitate those meetings. They are someone kind of without a dog in the fight that's there to help mediate if necessary and to take some of that planning and facilitation off the other key members so that they can focus on the actual content of the meeting. You'll also see some administration in these meetings. So administrators often hold the role that's called LEA. That stands for Local Education Agency. That's a role that is defined by the federal law that we'll talk about. And that is someone who must be familiar with general curriculum content. They must be familiar with ways to adapt that content or supervise someone who does. And most importantly, they have to be familiar with the resources that are available to the members of the meeting by what's called the public agency, so the school or the school district. So all meetings will also have to have an LEA, which is often represented by the principal or the vice principal or someone like that. So they are there to say, these are the resources that we have to offer within this school district. Couple more key players. There are a lot of us in this field. We have a speech language pathologist. You might hear this called an SLP. They need a master's or a PhD to be an SLP. They're governed by ASHA. In the handout, you'll see links to, from here on out, there'll be a lot of links to governing boards or TEA websites that describe a lot of these if you'd like to learn more about the certification process or what these different key players do. So what an SLP does is specializes in language, voice, fluency and stuttering, articulation. They can also support feeding and swallowing. So really kind of anything in this region, they can help support. Like I said, articulation, things like that. So a student that might have a speech impairment or have some motor skill deficits or needs, in this area might need a speech language pathologist. We also have an occupational therapist or an OT. They specialize in fine motor skills, coordination and sensory processing. They help adapt the environment or provide tools to help a student adapt to an environment and help them navigate that environment. So a lot of assistive technology comes from the OT. We have a physical therapist. This is someone who specializes in mobility, strength, joint range of motion, endurance, and gross motor skills. You do see a lot of physical therapists outside of education. That might be where you're more familiar with the term, but these specialists can help a student that might have some physical limitations more readily and independently navigate their environment. And then our last page of key players, I put on here behavior analyst. You might also hear behavior specialist. A behavior analyst I put on here, BCBA is the certified version of a behavior analyst. It stands for Board Certified Behavior Analyst. A behavior specialist is a little bit different, but I wanted to share the BCBA because you might hear those letters. And they have a governing board. Behavior specialists, just the title alone don't require that certification, but some of them do have it. Behavior specialists can really specialize in just about anything, but they're often brought in to help decrease challenging behaviors, increase desired classroom behaviors. They can also help with classroom management, but licensed behavior analysts can also support instruction. They look at all kinds of behavior, including academic behavior. We have orientation and mobility specialist, O&M, you might hear this referred to as, and this is someone who specializes in supporting individuals with visual impairments. And so they might teach a student how to use a cane or how to safely navigate their environment using other tools at their disposal. And then finally, there are many more, but the last one we'll talk about today is an adaptive PE coach. You may hear this called APE. I didn't put the dash in at first and it just looked like APE. So we don't call them APE. If you see that, it's APE for adaptive PE coach. And they require the same training as a regular school coach, but with some specialized training for adapting some of those skills. So they, similar to a PT, have that physical and motor skills support, but they also help support students in accessing leisure skills and other skills and activities that promote some socialization with same age peers, such as aquatics, dance, games, adapted sports, things like that. Through APE, when I was a teacher, my students went out in the community to play tennis, to go swimming, we went bowling, all of those things. And during APE, the adaptive PE coach would work with them on the skills to be successful in those environments. So those are most of our key players. I've seen the chat's gone up a little bit. Are we good so far?
Yeah. Just one question about how to get certified. So like she's certified in bilingual education. How do I become a special ed teacher?
I love that question. So it sounds like someone in the chat asked, how do I become certified to be a special educator? You can go through, like we have a degree program here for an undergraduate certificate. There are some master's degrees that can certify you to teach without being certified in your undergraduate. That's actually how I got certified myself. But there are also many alt-cert programs that can provide you with the certification that you need for that. So I just found this quote when we were talking about all the key players, and it says, coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. Henry Ford said that, and I like it because it reminds us of the importance of everyone who's at the table working together. So All of these players that I just mentioned, the key players I'll mention later that are required to be in these meetings, they all need to bring shared data. They need to hear each other's input and specialization areas. And most importantly, they all need to keep the target students' individual needs and traits and strengths and personality in mind when they're developing the IEP or going through the evaluation process. So is anyone's brain spinning yet? Hold on, because we have some more. This is the SPED alphabet. This is where you're going to hear a lot more acronyms and letters put together. And so I'm going to start to explain what they mean. So you might hear IEP. In fact, it was in the title of this presentation without any further explanation. An IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. Individualized Education Plan. That is a document that's prepared by a team of people who know and have assessed a specific student, and that plan is unique to that student, and it includes and dictates goals and services and accommodations and settings that that student will receive their educational process. We have ARD. I mentioned it earlier. ARD stands for Admission, Review, and Dismissal. So in Texas, this is the general process, the evaluation, the IEP, all of the meetings. This is the process: admission, review, and dismissal of special education. And so where in other states you might hear IEP meeting, IEP team, in Texas, and perhaps other states, I'm actually not sure, but I know Texas, you hear ARD meeting, ARD team. And so know that those two terms are interchangeable. BIP is a behavior intervention plan for students that might have some unique behavioral or emotional needs. You would conduct a thorough assessment and develop a behavior intervention plan, which is part of an IEP. And it is the specific plan that all staff and faculty working with that student should implement to help support their behavior needs, to increase appropriate behaviors and decrease challenging or school inappropriate behaviors. We have FIE, full individual evaluation. This is very much just what it sounds like. It is the evaluation of the student. It evaluates all areas of a student's different needs. You might have motor assessments, cognitive assessments, academic assessments, everything that all the specialists we just talked about. You might have evaluations in all those areas, and it helps determine the most important and the most pressing needs that the IEP and the ARD team should address. You might also see this referred to as FIIE, which might be the full initial individual evaluation, which would just be the first one. We have procedural safeguards. So at the start of the process and in several of these meetings, you should be handed procedural safeguards. These are your rights as parents, guardians, or self-advocates of a child with a disability. The rights relate to access to records, confidentiality, right to a full evaluation, least restrictive environment, things like that. And we'll review in more detail what those rights are towards the end. Due process is the process outlined by the law, IDEA, to resolve disputes about special education services. And that is also outlined. Okay, our last 6 for keywords. We still have some other things to talk about, but last 6 for keywords for the general terms. You might hear FAPE. In fact, I hope you hear FAPE. That stands for Free Appropriate Public Education, also part of the law that we'll look at. And that basically just says that your student has a right to access public education, not at your own expense, and that that education should be equitable and accessible to them. You might hear response to intervention. This is just a process for identifying more individualized interventions and trying different interventions and evidence-based practices to support your student. So you might hear that a student is going through RTI or you're trying RTI. This means that the teachers and the professionals supporting your student are trying different evidence-based practices before going for an evaluation for special education services. So this is something that's accessed by all general education students. We have MTSS, multi-tiered support system. It's very similar to RTI. It's the system within which RTI happens. And so it's, we'll see an image later that helps support this idea. So hold on to that one. You might hear LID or LID or HID. This is low or high incidence disability. This is the way that some of these disabilities are kind of put together or discussed in groups. And so the law defines low incidence disabilities as visual or hearing impairments or a combination of the two, significant cognitive impairment, or any impairment for which a small number of personnel with highly specialized skills are needed for early intervention or free and appropriate public education. We have PLAF. This is one you should definitely hear if you're going through the IEP process. You should ask, what are the PLAFs? So PLAF stands for present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. You may also hear these referred to as, it's a silly word, but PLOPs, which is present levels of performance, just shortened a little bit. So this is really important because through that assessment, through that FIE, that individual evaluation, you should be hearing and finding data that communicates the current levels of performance. And those levels of performance are critical for developing goals and services and accommodations and other methods of support. So those PLAFs are really important to have in there. And then our last acronym we're going to talk about, at least for right now, is an FBA, a functional behavior assessment. If we go back to that BIP, the functional behavior assessment is the assessment that's conducted to inform the behavior intervention plan. Okay, that was lots more. How are we doing? Hanging in there over there? Okay, we're gonna do a couple more things and then we're gonna have a retention check. So I hope you're paying attention. See how much you can remember. Sorry? Yeah, let's see. So some key terminology when you're going through the process, eligibility categories. So we'll talk towards the end about the difference between eligibility and disability, but the law that I keep referencing, IDEA, it outlines 13 categories under which a student might be eligible to receive services. So through the evaluation process, you look at all of your data and you kind of line it up with these categories and you decide which category best describes the most significant needs of this student. And that is the eligibility category under which they qualify. And what I tell my students is the category that you qualify under, your eligibility category, it doesn't necessarily mean you do or don't get certain services. It's just deciding which door you enter to go into the same room. So if you have a room with a bunch of doors, these eligibility categories, which door are you using to get into the same room to access all the same services? You may, if you are counting, you may notice that there are actually 14 up here. That is because Texas has this category. You can qualify under services if you are very young children qualify, but not under a category. Texas said, we're just going to give it a name, and that is non-categorical early childhood. So NCEC is not on the IDEA list, but if you ever, get bored and want to go read the law in your free time, IDEA does say children with who are very young, who are suspected of having a disability can receive early intervention. And that is what they're talking about in Texas NCEC. And the last key terms we're going to be talking about are settings, some different settings that you might hear, some common phrases you might hear thrown around in some of these meetings or evaluation processes. So these are not specific kinds of classrooms that I have listed here. These are more general ideas. Remember, we're talking big picture here. So you might hear resource or inclusion. Resource or inclusion classrooms are types of special education service settings that the student spends the majority of their time in general education classrooms. And so in these settings, students may have more access to the general education settings and peers, to the environments as their same age peers, and the general curriculum with supports and some minor adaptations. In self-contained settings, these are settings that are more removed from that general education setting. So more removed from that 3rd or 4th or 5th grade class. And in these settings, because of the self-contained nature, it gives teachers a little bit more structure to provide more major modifications or adaptations to the general curriculum. Your student will still access the general curriculum. All students will access that general ed content, but it's even more individualized in these settings. And then you also might hear transition settings. So these are services that are provided still through the law, so still through the public school setting, either before primary school, so early childhood education settings, or after a student would typically graduate. And so we'll talk about what a couple of those look like too. So these are just a couple examples. You will find this is one where district, state, school specific they're all different. Even as I was collecting a couple examples for the handout that I created for all of you, I heard of another new one yesterday that I had not heard of before. So they're all different kinds, but I just wanted to give you some examples of the variety that you might see. So you might hear ALS. That's an academic life skills setting. So that's one where they're taking the general education content and they're immediately turning it around to what is tomorrow's application of this content. And that's how we're going to teach it. You might hear AB or AB unit. That's an adaptive behavior unit. That's a classroom to help support students with more significant behavior needs or social emotional needs, social skills, managing maybe aggressive behavior, things like that. You might hear of a CASTLE program that is commonly used for students with autism, but it's not just for students with autism. It's CASTLE, the first one, stands for Collaboration for Autism and Autism Spectrum Teaching, Learning, and Excellence. There's also another CASTLE program called, I just looked at it, Communication and Social Learning. Yeah, thank you. And so that one is for any student that needs extra supports in communication and social learning, which is often correlated with autism, but not exclusively. You might hear life skills. That's the kind of class that I taught in. Here in many of these schools, life in life skills stands for learning in a functional environment. So again, really looking at the functional application of the curriculum, looking at independent learning, or independent living skills, self-help, domestic, oh my goodness, the word just flew out of my head, sorry. Functional, taking care, hygiene, there we go. So these are just a couple examples. In the handout, I've listed a couple more. But if you ever see a type of classroom that you haven't heard of before that's not listed here, my recommendation to you is to Google the term plus the name of your ISD. So maybe the one I heard yesterday was a flex classroom. So I would Google Flex Classroom, College Station ISD, and then look for websites that are either run by that ISD or the region or TEA. And that will likely give you a pretty good explanation of what that classroom's for. That's where I got a lot of these. Okay, how are we feeling? Has anyone's brain exploded? See any exploded brains over there, Dr. Roberts? Okay. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is a retention check. So I hope you were paying attention. If you can, please grab a piece of paper. I meant to say this at the beginning and I forgot, so I'll give you a moment. You need a clean piece of paper. And you should fold it into thirds. So the picture on the screen, you'll see there's a clear middle panel and then two equal sides, one on each side. So you need a trifold. Give a few more moments for everyone to get that. As you're getting your paper, on the far left-hand side, Please write numbers 1 through 5. And I will be taking these up at the end, so just kidding, you're all on Zoom. Okay, so you should have a paper folded into thirds, and on the far left-hand side, third, 1 through 5. Can you give Dr. Roberts a thumbs up if you are ready for your retention check? We can take some time. We can take some time. Okay, we're gonna get started. So question number 1. So you'll write the answer to this next to the number 1 that you wrote down. What is the term for the evaluation of a student to determine eligibility? So next to number 1, write the answer to what is the term for the evaluation of a student to determine eligibility. I encourage you to not look at the resource sheet if you can help it. Just write it on your paper. Make sure you don't say it out loud or share it with anyone else. Okay, next to number 2, you're going to write on your paper the answer to this question. What does ARD stand for? What does ARD stand for? Next to number 2, write the answer to what does ARD stand for? We did a Halloween, a costume day at the end of October in one of my courses here at A&M, and I was a pirate because I love arts. Next to number 3, what is the name of the rights of parents and students as outlined in the law? Write it next to number 3 on your paper. What is the name of the rights of parents and students as outlined in the law? A few more seconds. Okay, on number 4 on your paper, what does NCEC stand for? What does NCEC stand for? One of those eligibility categories we talked about. What does NCEC stand for? And number 5, right next to number 5, what kinds of students are served in a Castle classroom? Sorry? That's not the answer. Okay, so now we're going to look at the answers. Number 1, a full individual evaluation, FIE. Number 2, ARD stands for admission, review, and dismissal. Number 3, procedural safeguards. Number 4, non-categorical early childhood. And number 5, it may be students with autism, but specifically students with social and communication needs. It's not just for students with autism, and all students with autism will not go into a Castle classroom. How'd we do? Okay.
Yeah.
Guess what? We're gonna do it again. Fold it around. So fold number 1, that first panel, back behind the middle panel. Don't look at the answers.
Jay got an A+.
Good job, Jay. Your computer's going to die. I don't know. I thought that would charge it, but it's okay. So in the middle panel, 1 through 5, again, we're gonna check it again. Ready? Number 1, middle panel. What is the eligibility NCEC? What do those letters stand for? What does NCEC stand for? See if you can do it without looking at your first panel. Look at you, Jennifer Crawford. Way to go. See if you can do it again. Okay, number 2 on the middle panel. What does ARD stand for? The answer is not pirate. Number 2, what does ARD stand for? Number 3, middle panel. What kinds of needs are served in a Castle classroom? What kinds of needs are served in a Castle classroom? A little bit faster since we're working on fluency here. Number 4, what is the term for the evaluation of a student to determine eligibility? What's the term for the evaluation of a student that helps determine eligibility? And number 5, middle panel. What is the name of the rights of parents and students as outlined in the law? Rights of parents and students as outlined in the law. Okay, we're going to check it. Are you ready? And go. Number 1, non-categorical early childhood. 2, ARD stands for admission, review, and dismissal. Number 3, students with social and communication needs. Number 4, full individual evaluation, or FIE. And number 5, procedural safeguards. Okay, guess what? We have 3 panels. We're gonna do it one more time. One more time, we're checking retention now. You'll never forget these 5 things. We're gonna go a little bit faster to also look at fluency. 1 through 5, panel 3. Okay, get ready, it's gonna be faster. What's the name of the rights of parents and students as outlined in the law? Rights of parents and students outlined in the law. Number 2, what does NCEC stand for? What does NCEC stand for? Number 3. What is the term for the evaluation of a student to determine eligibility? What is the term for the evaluation of a student to determine eligibility? Number 4. What needs are served in a Castle classroom? What needs are served in a Castle classroom? And finally, number 5. What does ARD stand for? What does ARD stand for? Ready to check it? Number 1, procedural safeguards. Number 2, non-categorical early childhood. Number 3, FIE. Number 4, students with social and communication needs. And number 5, admission, review, and dismissal. Did everyone get 100% on the 3rd time? You are my window into the Zoom.
Yeah, I'm getting some smiles. Yes.
Awesome. Just a little activity to measure maintenance and retention, or retention at least for a little bit. Okay. Thanks for engaging in that with me. So now we're going to move on to the evaluation timeline. So again, this is very general. It'll look different for different students based on different needs, but this is just some general expectations that you might. Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for being flexible. Can't be special educators if we're not flexible, right? That's one thing they never say. They always say patient and they always say big heart. They never say flexible. Okay, here we go. So we just finished that activity and now we're going to dive into the evaluation timeline. So again, I think what I was saying when I dived was that this is very broad and general. So this might not exactly apply to you, but it'll give you an idea of what the process will look like. So this is the, again, very general timeline. So you'll have systematic supports within general education, and that's where someone might throw up a red flag and say, I think the student might need to be evaluated. That's what's called the referral, step number 2. The referral, if the school makes the choice to move forward, then you go to the evaluation. And from there, you look at the results of the evaluation, determine the eligibility. And if they determine the student is eligible under one of those categories we looked at for special education services, then you develop the appropriate documents. And we'll talk through what each of those looks like. So this is the MTSS triangle that I referenced earlier, the multi-tiered system of support. So in this, what you're looking at here is a triangle that's green on the bottom. It says academics or behavior, and it has the word all. That means all students are receiving those supports. You might hear this referred to as tier 1 supports. Students that might have some more significant needs or aren't successful in either behavior or academics at that bottom level, that tier 1 level, they might move into what you may hear called tier 2 supports. This is part of the RTI process as well. And so this is more individualized, a little bit more intensive, again, for both academic or behavior needs, where students are getting that more individualized support, but not receiving special education services yet. They haven't been evaluated yet. This is a process where through these systematic supports, the school system is kind of saying, let's see if with a little bit more, we can keep them in this general education population, in this general education setting, and not have that need for evaluation. If you still need more supports, if you're still not seeing success or improvement in that academic or behavior realms, then that's where you would move to what's often called tier 3. And it's that towards that top where the triangle turns yellow and then red. Much fewer students move to that tier, and that is where you are evaluated for possible special education supports, and you receive even more intensive and more individualized supports there. And so through this process, through this triangle, moving from tier 1 up to tier 3 is where someone might say, hey, I think there's a red flag. I think that the student might need more than what we can provide them in the general education setting. They might need some accommodations or modifications. They might need some individualized supports, some special settings, things like that to help support that student. One thing to note here is some students with more significant needs, they may move straight up to that tier 3, particularly very young students with very significant needs, perhaps that fall under that non-categorical early childhood. They might go ahead and start receiving early intervention services sooner. What was the question? Oh, that's a good question. So someone asked, how often is the evaluation or the assessment process wrong? So someone might have a need for special education services, but that's not reflected in the assessment. I don't have data or statistics to support that. I know that it can happen. I know that once you've gone through an evaluation and you have eligibility, there's something called a reevaluation process where you can look to see if there's a different eligibility, but I'm not sure how frequently it's incorrect. And I think perhaps using different supports in the RTI process might help identify some different supports that might support that student. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, Dr. Roberts was noting that sometimes when they're younger, it can be harder to detect what that need or disability is, and the differentiation between that student and their peers might not be significant enough to detect quite yet, but as they get a little bit older, it might become more significant, which is unfortunate because then they miss out on some earlier interventions. Yeah, good question. So that is how many students come to be flagged or kind of tapped for evaluation. So from there, we have the referral process, and a teacher, an administrator, another school professional, such as the school counselor, can make a referral, or the parent or guardian can make a referral. And this is a referral for evaluation for special education. And so if the school decides to move forward with that referral to move towards evaluation, they have 15 days to get written consent if they decide to evaluate from the guardian. So once you get that consent, the full individual evaluation will take place, that FIE that we talked about earlier. If that's what's determined as most appropriate by what's called the eligibility team. And the eligibility team is established at this point. This is the group of people who will help review the data and make the decision for the best placement and the best eligibility, the best supports for your student. And that team consists of the LEA. Remember, that's the local education agency, someone who can say, hey, these are the supports and resources that we have access to. Often an administrator serves in this role. The family is a required part of this team, or the guardian, the general education and the special education teacher, and an LSSP, so that licensed specialist in school psychology, someone who administers the evaluations and scores them and writes the reports and brings the results back to the table. So someone asked, do we wait until they're older? If so, what's the common age for an evaluation? That is a tricky question. And one of the downsides of this talk, because I know it will probably bring up a lot of questions, is I can't advise on really specific situations because I don't have the background and the information for that particular student. So what I hope to do with this, and what I hope is helpful for you, is looking at the resources that I shared, and particularly moving forward, the folder that I shared, there are a lot of documents like the ARD process and eligibility, and documents that I've gathered that I did not make. They're from TEA and IDEA and some different reputable sites that can hopefully guide you through that decision-making process and when you might want to move forward again and maybe try to advocate for another evaluation. So I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful. So during this evaluation, the eligibility team will be collecting data. So you'll have, the student will go through a series of different assessments. The law does say you cannot just do one assessment. So you should expect several, if not many. And these assessments will look at all different areas of potential needs. So you could have academic assessments, motor skills assessments, you could have cognitive assessments. In fact, many of the eligibility categories do require IQ scores to determine that eligibility. A lot require academic scores as well. There may be requests for work samples, there may be observations of the student, there may be adaptive behavior, so independent living, self-care, safety type skills, and social emotional behavior skills. So all of those different areas will be assessed by the teacher, possibly by the general educator, and by different specialists that might come in who are expertise, their expertise lies in those specific areas. And the LSSP will be administering a lot as well. And that'll happen over the course of about 45 days. Oh, my computer's dead. That's okay. So once you have the evaluation completed, the team will meet within 30 days of the evaluation being complete to determine eligibility. And so this is a really key concept here. Just diagnosis versus eligibility. So diagnosis is based on a set of criteria from what's called the DSM-5. It is like a medical handbook. And that a diagnosis might refer to a specific disorder. So Fragile X, autism spectrum disorder, Rett syndrome, things like that. So specific disorders. Whereas an eligibility is going to refer to a broader category, just one of those 13. So several diagnoses, it went away, so I got it. There you go. Diagnosis may fall under, may be encapsulated by one eligibility category. So know that one doesn't always equal the other. Diagnoses are used in private settings, often with insurance agencies, and they can be determined by a single doctor or an individual private team. So the difference is eligibility is solely based on those eligibility categories that we saw earlier, which is outlined by IDEA. So again, those broader disability categories, they're only used in the public school systems and they have to be determined by that entire team. So even the LSSP, that school psychologist, is often administering a lot of those assessments, but they won't make the eligibility decision on their own. It's a team decision. So it's important to know that a student can have a diagnosis, but not be deemed eligible. So to be deemed eligible, you have to show an adverse educational impact. So through all these assessments and evaluation, you have to show whatever's going on with the student, it is negatively affecting their educational process. It's impacting their ability to learn and progress. So you can have a diagnosis and you might find that they're not eligible because you don't find that educational impact, and vice versa. You can be determined, there we go. You can be determined eligible. You can find eligibility for special education services without having a medical diagnosis. And so you may have both, but it's important to know that you might not, that you might just have one or the other. So having a diagnosis does not automatically mean your child is eligible for special education services. Common examples of these are ADHD or autism. Having that diagnosis, you still, the evaluation would have to show educational impact to have eligibility and access those special education services. Any questions around any of that? So once you determine eligibility, you have a couple paths. If they determine that the student is not eligible, that there aren't any changes, you might go back into the RTI process and continue some of those more intensive interventions, but in the general education setting without special education services. You might be deemed not eligible, but there might be some identified supports that do need to be put in place. That is where you might need a 504 plan, which is a whole nother talk. Just know that that might be a buzzword you want to look into, but I'm not going to address it here. And then if they're deemed eligible, then you identify that category that best describes how they're eligible. And then the team develops an IEP, that individualized education plan. And this is what the basic components of an IEP are. So you'll have annual goals. These are any number of goals that are individualized to your student based on that evaluation data. So they are the goals that within the year, between that date and 1 year from then, the student should be progressing on and collecting data. They're getting individualized instruction and supports on those goals. The goals there should be some academic goals, but there also might be a speech and language goal. There might be a physical goal, a goal related to occupational therapy, behavior goals, social emotional goals, whatever is important for that student to progress. You'll have those PLAFs. Anyone remember what PLAF stands for? Why are you laughing at? It is hard to remember. Does anyone remember? It's a lot to type, so I'm gonna give everyone a second. See if anyone remember what PLAF stands for. If you remember PLOP, you could put that too. Yeah, the general idea is present levels of performance. The official term is present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, capturing all of those levels of performance. But yeah, their current levels. What can they do right now across all these areas? It's going to include accommodations and modifications. So extra tools or services or changes in the curriculum that are unique to that student to help them be successful and access that general curriculum. It should dictate their participation level in general education. So how often are they in the general education setting with those same age peers? How often are they in different types of settings? That's referred to as the least restrictive environment, which we'll talk about at the very end when we talk about law and policy. It should also dictate special education or related services. So if the evaluation finds that the student needs extra support in areas of behavior or speech and language, articulation, any kind of special area like that, all those specialists we talked about at the very beginning, this is where you would write in those services and determine based on the evaluation how much of each service they need and how frequently to meet those goals that we have up at the top. And then when appropriate, you'll also have post-secondary goals and transition services, as well as, depending on the district, a smattering of other things that go in there. But these are the big things that you want to look for that really dictate the education that your student will be receiving. And all of these come from related laws and policies. So we're going to talk briefly about the law that I keep bringing up that has really outlined, there are several laws related to education and disability, but we're really going to focus on IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Act. And specifically, we're going to focus on what's called Part B. So IDEA has 4 parts. In the handout that I gave you at the very top of this section of the handout, there is a link to a website that I found very helpful that very succinctly describes what each part is for. But we're going to talk about Part B because Part B outlines all these things. So we should recognize a bunch of these keywords now, right? So we talked about FAPE. And so IDEA, the federal law, outlines that free, appropriate public education should be provided at no cost to the families. And this ensures that accommodations and services are provided for equal access. And so that's what that part of Part B outlines for education. It also defines an individualized education plan, an IEP. And so that's the document that lays out the specific steps to support your child in accessing FAPE and accessing that free, appropriate public education. That's where all of those goals and accommodations and services come from. It outlines procedural safeguards. So procedural safeguards, as we mentioned earlier, are the rights for families and students with disabilities. And this will be rights in participating in the process, in having notification of what's happening, of the evaluations and the meetings that are planned, confidentiality of your students' records, access to their records. All of those are different variables that are part of those procedural safeguards. Part B of IDEA also outlines least restrictive environment. So I've said that a couple times. LRE is another buzzword that you might hear sometimes, and that is the idea that education and services should be provided in what's called the least restrictive environment to your student. And so the IDEA Part B states that if possible, a student should be placed in what they call, quote, a typical education setting when and if possible with those same age peers. So really whatever environment is as close to that typical educational setting as possible that best serves the student. And that will change based on the student and that student's needs. Participation, it does outline that input of the child and the guardians should be taken into consideration when developing the IEPs, behavior intervention plans, all of these important educational processes. And then if your needs if you feel that your needs are not being met, IDEA does outline due process, which is the process by which you can go through and resolve disputes related to special education. Just do note it is a timely and intense process, but that is something that's outlined in the law as well. And then finally, IDEA Part B outlines having an appropriate evaluation. So it says that any student who may have a disability that might substantially impact their learning or their behavior, they're entitled to a full individual evaluation in all areas that are related to that suspected disability, and that should be conducted by the school. So that's the FIE that we talked about, that full evaluation process to determine the needs and the best setting for that student. So good over there. So what is required of these ARDs? We're getting towards the end here. So if you've held on, kudos to you, because this is a lot of information. So who has to be at the table? The people who are required to be at the table when we go through this process is a special education teacher. This person is going to be the accommodation and modification specialist. They know ways to individualize this content for your student. You have the general education teacher. This is the content specialist. They can help identify kind of where the student needs to go, where that target is for the same age peers, and making sure that the core curriculum, the general education content, is infused into the student's individualized education plan. You have your LEA, local education agency. That person can speak to the school and district resources that are available as you're writing them into the individualized plan. And then the guardians. The guardians are required to be there. You guys are the student specialists. You know your child, you know your child's history, and so your input and your place at the table is important. I did want to make a note sometimes, particularly if you are here and you are a parent or guardian and you are newer to an IEP process, it can sometimes be intimidating when you walk into a room, because a lot of these specialists are usually, meetings are often after school or during school, they're often held at the school, and you may walk into a room full of people. So I wanted you to know who that room full of people might be. Know that they're all there for you and your student, and that they recognize that you are the student specialist, and that they do have specializations in different areas, but they do need and value your input. So I know it can be intimidating, but I hope this helps make it a little bit less intimidating when you walk into that setting. So when do you have an ARD meeting? We've talked about these meetings a lot. We talked about the process. You'll have that initial meeting. It's called an initial ARD meeting. That is to determine the placement. That's right after your eligibility. So if you've gone through the evaluation, it's the very first meeting to determine the very first IEP and what is the best setting and resources to serve that student. From there, you'll have an annual ARD or IEP meeting. So every single year, it is required to revisit and kind of rewrite and update the IEP. You don't have to do the entire evaluation process every year. That happens, or the option to do it happens every 3 years. But do go ahead and mark it on your calendars. Within about a month of the meeting you just had, know about a year from now, we're going to all be meeting again. So go ahead and put it on there and look out for information. If I know a lot of my students, we would send home notes and they would not make it home. So if you know it's about a month out from your IEP, your ARD meeting, and you haven't seen a note, you might want to send your teacher an email and just say, just want to make sure, haven't gotten anything home, want to make sure it's still happening, and get that on the calendar. So that happens every year. It doesn't mean that anything's wrong or bad or good. It just means that you're required to have that every year. You might have an ARD or an IEP amendment. That just means that something needs to change in the IEP, whether it's a service that's not working or a behavior plan that's not effective, or your student just crushed it and they mastered their goals in 7 months instead of a year. So you need to meet again to determine more goals and perhaps more challenging goals next time. So an amendment is just called if you need to change anything in the IEP. Because the IEP comes from federal law, it is a legal document. And so to change it, you need the team at the table. And then finally, anytime you want, if you're a guardian, you have the right to call an IEP or an ARD meeting anytime that you see fit, if you have something you want to talk about. As we wrap up, I wanted to share parent rights. The full set of parent rights are very long and they are full of even more jargon than is in this presentation. But I wanted to share a document that is in the folder that you all have access to, and I have it linked here. You will see this says, this document says Georgia. Part of that is because that is where I taught, so it's what I'm familiar with. But I also have not found a TEA version similar to this. So if you all have one or know of one or want to make one, that would be super. So I like this document because it's what I like to call a cheat sheet. It is a brief overview. The full procedural safeguards are about 14 pages, I think, last time I checked, but I don't remember, don't quote me on that. But this is just a 2-page document, and it briefly outlines your rights as a guardian of a child with a disability. And so you can see here, some of these are rights to look at your child's educational records, the right to a full and complete evaluation, confidentiality. Your child has the right to be taught in a least restrictive environment. So yes, it is one of the resources that I shared. I added it today. So if you looked yesterday, it wasn't there, but it's in there now. Yes, so I just wanted to share this with you to review. Also, if you're here and you're a teacher and you're nervous about talking about the procedural safeguards, I find this really helpful to review briefly before I go into an ARD meeting to remind myself of all the things to tell the parents. So I just wanted to share that. Those are your rights as outlined by IDEA and as put succinctly by Georgia Department of Education. So if you go into an ARD meeting, the things that you can expect to hear, probably no matter what the purpose of the meeting is to hear updates on how your student is performing, how they're progressing towards the goals, how they're performing during the different services that are outlined in that IEP. You should have an opportunity to express any concerns. I encourage you personally, as a previous teacher, to, if you have concerns, express them before the IEP meeting or the ARD meeting and have an ongoing communication with your teacher so that you can work together, because you're both there at the end of the day for that student. But that is a place where you can express concerns and have them officially noted in that document. This is also where you might make changes with the team, changes to services, updating goals, change to setting, changes to accommodations or modifications. All of those things can happen in that ARD meeting. And then reviewing any proposed goals. And so in a lot of settings, when you go into an ARD meeting, all of those professionals have been collecting data from you throughout the year. They collect input from you before the ARD meeting, and they may come to the table with proposed goals. Nothing is official until you all meet together, but they may say, hey, based on your child's performance, based on the data that we collected, based on the survey that we sent you a couple weeks ago on what's important to you, we've crafted these goals. What do you think? We've amended these services. What do you think? And so it's a place for you to come and I'll review that together. And then finally, we're gonna be perfect on time, how you can support the process. So I'm sure we have a smattering of people here. So if you are another educational professional, or excuse me, education professional here, if you're a paraprofessional, an SLP, a general educator, even another special educator, things that you can do to help the IEP process is to contribute to IEP development. Whoever's writing it, they have a lot to write. It's a lot and it's very important and it's very detailed and you need a lot of data to back it up. And so reaching out, or if you get a request to contribute something, trying to do that as timely as possible and bringing data to support whatever your arguments or ideas are. Make sure you attend and engage in those meetings. So talking through, making sure you're giving your input, you're listening, because if you're in the meeting, your name goes on the paper and you sign that you were there and that you either agree or disagree with what's in it. And so making sure that you're engaged and supporting everyone at the table. And then ask questions if you don't know, if you're not sure, especially before an ARD meeting, asking the special educator, the ARD facilitator, what does this word mean? What do you want me to do? What should I bring? What data do you want me to have in there? So making sure that you ask questions, because that's a lot easier for us to help. If you have any concerns, again, ideally before you're all sitting in the meeting, if you have some concerns, let the SPED teacher know, hey, I know this accommodation is in place. I don't find it's working, or I know this behavior intervention plan is in place. I'm having trouble doing this. So communicating all of those things before the meeting and then also during the meeting as appropriate. As I said, come with and share data and progress. I always say to bring happy things too. So I always try to start an ARD meeting with fun, happy success stories of that student. I had a parent tell me once that it was the first meeting, the student was in 3rd grade, and they said, this is the first meeting where someone said something kind about my child. So some of these meetings can be hard. Some parents might come combative, and it's because that's their learning history. That's been their experience. And so I try to start with something happy, even if it's not the happiest meeting. Hey, Johnny did this today. And I thought it was really cool. He's really being a leader in this area. And then if you do have access to any documents, an IEP, a behavior intervention plan, please read those very carefully. I always tell my students it's just like a syllabus. If you have it, not reading it is not an excuse for not doing what's in it. You have to do what's in it if you have that in your hand. If you've been given access, you are legally responsible for what's in it. So make sure you review. And then again, if you don't understand, ask questions. And then if you're a parent or guardian or a self-advocate, stay plugged into student progress. Even if you're here as an individual with a disability, stay plugged into your own progress. Make sure you're keeping up with those things so that then when it's time for your input for that IEP or any other document or process, you have some updated knowledge that can help inform your preferences. Advocate for student involvement, especially as students get a little bit older, having them in the room for these meetings. And then not being afraid to ask questions. Again, we're here to support you and to support your student. And your understanding of this process is just as important as everyone else's in the room. See, it's almost 3 o'clock quickly, or it's just past 3. Try to connect with resources in the community. The CDD is great for that, and they can plug you in. And the school systems will also have a lot of resources that can help continue whatever's happening through this process outside of the school walls. Similarly, if you can, creating consistency between school and home to help those supports and those behaviors carry over. And then letting teacher or school knows when something happens or changes. A brief example of that, whenever you feel it's appropriate and you feel comfortable to share. I had a student that had a major medication change and it totally changed what we were doing in the classroom. And having that heads up from the parent really helped and allowed us to collaborate on what was the best overall support for that student. So anything from moving homes or being gone for a while, or medical changes is really helpful to know. So finally, I want to remind us again, coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And so it requires the whole team to know all the things that we just talked about for success. So as we wrap up, remember, everything I said. It's different across schools and districts and states, but I officially welcome you to the world of SPED, where we have our own language. So thank you so much for hanging with me today and going wading through the technical difficulties. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. They also made the mistake of letting me run our social media. So if you want to follow us on Instagram or Facebook, you can find us at TAMU Special Education. We love to elevate the profession and highlight our awesome teachers. So thanks, everybody. Oh, me personally? So it sounds like we had a question about whether or not I personally, or maybe A&M, our program provides outside services to parents. I don't personally, outside of things like this with the CDD, I also really enjoy providing professional development to school districts, but I haven't done something for parents specifically. However, if that's something that the CDD wants to partner with, I really like working with parents. But currently outside of this talk, no, I don't. But I'm happy to share some resources if you email me.